At 03:11:27 UTC, near right ascension 12 hours and declination plus 8 degrees, the target swept through its perihelion arc under thin cirrus and steady seeing. The first station's light curve climbed too fast for the phase angle, then bent a short, hard inflection that baseline curves do not own. A second station, an ocean away, logged the same feature at the expected delay. The data set now held a choice framed by methods, not adjectives, instrument, habit, or genuine sky. The relay shifted without theatrics. Apertures stepped down, bands narrowed, and guiding tolerances tightened. Frames were restacked against conservative flats. 0 points rode on stable standards. A compact run of clean points survived the pressure. Forward scattering could defend the brightening. Geometry could excuse mild asymmetry, yet neither settled the cadence of the bend. A pilot radio sweep stayed quiet within declared limits, which removed only the loudest stories and left the careful ones standing. Avi Loeb forwarded the trace to the 3i Atlas list with a single instruction: replicate before you interpret. No flourish followed, only coordinates, scripts, and a window that would not wait. Telescopes on 3 continents cued identical sequences, clocks disciplined to GPS, colored terms pinned to comparison stars, headers left intact. The rule remained public and simple: if it is real, it will survive better light. Whatever some might call impossible would earn its name the same way anything does here, by passing through tests and refusing to disappear. Perihelion is a brief corridor where gravity, sunlight, and viewing angle conspire to exaggerate small effects. An object sprints to its lowest solar distance, phase angles tighten, surfaces and dust, if present, throw light forward in narrow cones. Thermal load rises. Sublimation, when there are volatiles, can wake jets, and tiny torques adjust trajectories. It is also where reduction pipelines are most tempted to chase patterns. The team treats perihelion as a lab with strict rules: high signal, high risk, and no second attempt at the same geometry. Observability is negotiated between sky and hardware. Optical imagers carry broad and medium bands to anchor color terms. Near-infrared channels probe warm continua. Radio backends sweep for narrow carriers and transient bursts. Guiding tolerances contract. Exposure ladders step in small increments, and flats are refreshed to follow twilight drift. Dynamic range is kept generous to protect brightening spikes. Cadence is kept honest to avoid sculpting structure. Baseline frames bracket the window, so normal is measured, not guessed. History supplies the ledger for comparison. For modest albedo bodies without active outgassing, perihelion phase curves are smooth. Forward scattering can steepen the rise, but seldom produces abrupt kinks. Known comae impose gentle chromatic slopes and faint emission bands. Non-gravitational forces, when present, appear as slow astrometric residuals rather than sudden discontinuities. Against that file, any sharp bend demands 2 proofs at minimum: independent timing agreement and a spectrum that either explains or refuses the light. The pipeline is engineered to doubt itself before doubting the sky. Bias and dark maps are versioned, flats traced to field standards, photometric 0 points ride stable comparison stars. Timestamps are disciplined to GPS, shutter latencies are characterized, and rolling shutter signatures are modeled rather than hand-waved. Cross-station merges require agreement on point spread metrics and sky background. Only when local failure modes are exhausted does an outlier graduate to the shared queue that consumes scarce minutes on other telescopes. Hypotheses organize labor and prevent drift. Natural branches include extreme surface roughness with narrow forward lobes, transient jets, or unresolved subcomponents that geometry blends. Artificial branches require repeatable modulation, coherent timing, or micromaneuvers that survive conservative astrometry. Detection limits prune both trees. Radio silence above a documented floor cuts loud beacons. Lack of thermal excess caps waste heat claims. Null spectral lines deny the right of EasyJets to explain photometry without paying a spectral cost. Upper limits are archived beside detections because quantified absence constrains models as tightly as a line on a plot, and what remains after pruning is the map the investigation will follow. The ignition looked like routine because routine is the shield against drama. A compact bulletin moved across the list: coordinates, cadence, aperture, range, rationale in 3 lines. Avi Loeb had tagged the Perihelion kink as replication worthy and anchored the request to a simple order defeat instrument bias first. The network answered with procedure. Scripts were cloned byte for byte, exposure ladders mirrored, comparison stars fixed. The aim was not to polish a curve, but to let it fail or hold under pressure. Objectives were written in the order data can deliver them. First, verify the feature across independent instruments and skies. Second, measure its shape with enough precision to evict familiar ghosts, scattering slopes, seeing wiggles, shudder folklore. Third, probe timing for periodic structure and crush aliasing before any narrative forms. Fourth, examine astrometric residuals for small, coherent drifts that geometry alone does not buy. Everything downstream waits behind these gates. Confirmation meant redundancy, not spectacle. Stations separated by oceans and weather executed identical photometry on disciplined clocks. 0 points tied to the same standards, header metadata left intact. Reductions were versioned. Recipes traveled with checksums. If the kink collapsed under this weight, it would return to the drawer of anecdotes. If it endured, the burden would move from plausibility to mechanism, and the hypothesis tree would gain real mass. Characterization followed by color and spectrum. Differential magnitudes in paired bands would catch forward scattering disguised as structure, while seeing metrics tracked atmospheric interference in real time. A narrow spectral sweep, low in resolution but clean in calibration, would search for faint emission lines that volatile activity often leaves. A quiet spectrum would elevate surface or geometry explanations. Any line would hand the stage back to jets and dust. The goal was not surprise but fit. Timing analysis carried the sharpest blade. Windowed periodograms and autocorrelation would run on overlapping station segments. Synthetic injections would map detection limits and false peaks. Rolling shutter signatures, GPS quantization, and guiding cycles would be modeled and subtracted before trusting any peak. A pattern that rides the hardware earns a name and an exit. A pattern that ignores the hardware earns replication in a harder court. Different instruments, perturbed cadence, hostile weather. Astrometry guarded the temptation to romanticize. Observed minus computed positions would be fit against conservative orbits, with thermal recoil granted the first right of explanation. Plate constants would be alternated, field distortions modeled, catalogs swapped to expose bias. Only residuals that survive these changes get tabled as micromaneuver candidates. The standing rule stays plain. Let the easy stories win if they can. Costs were totaled in parallel. Minutes at large apertures are rare currency, and steering them requires a written case. Reputation spends just as quickly as telescope time. The stance, therefore, remains formal thresholds first, adjectives never. The document that frames this effort commits to publishing limits and nulls with the same visibility as claims. Promotion criteria were fixed before the next exposure. A modulation claim must persist through hardware swaps, cadence, jitter, and phase angle drift. An astrometric kick must hold when catalogs and thermals are changed. Passing lifts belief, Failing returns the feature to silence. With those gates in place, the ignition ends where good investigations begin. A small anomaly, a narrow plan, and tests strong enough to keep both from wandering. The first sequence opened under cautious skies and stricter rules. Desert and island stations ran the same script line for line. Short exposures in tight ladders. Narrow guiding tolerances. Band choices fixed in advance. Every frame carried its ancestry, flats, darks, 0 points inside the header. Reductions wrote their recipes into the log as they ran. The goal was not aesthetics, but convergence. Make independent pipelines agree, or force the feature to fall apart. Merged photometry began with slow handshakes. Twilight flats were normalized, bad pixels flagged, 0 points pinned to a small tier of stable comparison stars. Per station, the curve behaved until it didn't. At near matching phase angles, both sets tipped upward more steeply than baseline laws permit. The bend reappeared smaller than rumor, larger than noise. Rank update. Natural forward scattering kept the lead. Engineered modulation received its first non-trivial entry. Color checks tried to earn the easy explanation and failed to collect it. Differential magnitudes across paired bands traced BV through the feature. A chromatic tilt would have comforted dust or gas. Within errors, the bend stayed largely achromatic. That did not crown an artificial source, but it trimmed the outgassing story. Rank update. Volatile jet slid down. Rough surface or geometry with a narrow forward lobe remained the natural favorite. Modulation rose from hypothetical to possible. The second sequence turned to spectrum low resolution by design, high discipline by habit. Slits were conservative. Telerics corrected against nearby standards. Wavelength solutions verified with lamps and skylines. Expectations were modest. A sodium hint, a faint CN band, any whisper that activity had left on the light. The channels came back quiet, a smooth continuum without decisive lines. Silence does not prove dryness. It makes the jet explanation pay a surcharge. Rank update. Jet-based accounts lost ground. Surface reflectance and geometry climbed. Engineered modulation stood unchanged, neither helped nor harmed by the blank. Timing held the sharper blade. Windowed periodograms and autocorrelations ran on overlapping station segments, but only after synthetic injections mapped what could and could not be seen. Manufacturer clocks provided rolling shutter profiles. GPS discipline was checked against a traveling reference. Guiding cycles were modeled, not guessed. After subtractions that punished optimism, a shallow peak remained in the short sub-minute regime at multiple stations. It was small. It was persistent. It disliked being chased away. Rank update. Modulation advanced from possible to plausible. Scattering as aliasing stayed on the board but lost comfort. Skeptics demanded an inversion. The identical tools were unleashed on comparison stars of similar brightness and color with the same cadence and exposure ladders. If the algorithm hallucinated structure, it would do so consistently. The control targets remained statistically flat. The claimed cadence refused to migrate. That did not certify a beacon. It fenced out the friendliest system ghosts. Rank update. Hardware alias paid a tariff. Modulation edged upward with a caution flag. Geometry then asserted itself. A modeling team tortured Henier-Greenstein phase functions and layered microfacet distributions to mimic clustered roughness and unresolved companions. In silico, narrow lobes and precise sight lines could yield abrupt turns. Fits improved, yet would not sit still. Residuals massed near the kink tight, resilient, irritating. Rank update. Natural geometry kept the top slot, now annotated with an asterisk. Engineered modulation part just behind waiting for one more credible witness. Astrometry joined with its usual lack of romance. Observed minus computed positions were fitted to a conservative orbit. Thermal recoil claimed first rights. Plate constants were alternated. Field distortions modeled. Reference catalogs swapped. Nightly solutions reweighted. A tiny, coherent lean threaded the window, no jump, just a steady nudge grazing detection thresholds. Rank update. Micromaneuver scenarios earned a footnote. Thermal explanations retained primacy. A systematics interlude kept the audit honest. Flats were stress tested for gradients. Bias frames trended across nights. Sky backgrounds measured through dithered offsets. PSF shape monitored against seeing and focus drift. A shared failure that imitates the same cadence across stations is rare, but not impossible. Rare is still the burden to kill. The sweep found no cross-site flaw at the right period and phase. The anomaly survived boredom. Rank update. Artifact probability stepped down another rung. Radio work reported without adjectives. Narrowband sweeps across common beacon lanes. Found no carrier above the stated floor. Burst searches returned nothing beyond threshold. Silence does not endorse nature. It trims the loud. If an engineered source exists, it conserves power or speaks elsewhere. Rank update. Flamboyant beacons were pruned. Quiet or coated branches remained. Natural geometry retained Occam's edge. Near-infrared checks hunted for waste heat that might glow gently beyond optical bands. Photometry set ceilings rather than headlines. Within errors, no decisive lift appeared. Subtle warmth could hide. Radiant inefficiency could not. Rank update. High power engineering dropped. Low signature engineering and natural scattering remained neck and neck, separated by thrift and parsimony. Replication arrived from beyond the network, and that counted most. One university group reproduced the bend with an independent pipeline and released both curves and code. Another team filed a null under poor seeing and withdrew it without grievance, noting atmosphere as the culprit. The positive replication raised the anomaly status from rumor to event. The honest null strengthened the error bars. Rank update. Reproducibility increased total weight. Ordering of hypotheses held, but with firmer numbers beneath. Polarimetry thin and weather limited added a small, ambiguous hinge. If forward scattering dominated, polarization should pivot across phase. Early points hinted at a change with error, bars too wide to name a value. No poetry was read into noise. The hint was banked as a reason to return when geometry cooperates. Rank update. Natural scattering neither rescued nor failed. Modulation remained a parallel thread awaiting phase-agnostic proof. As nights bled away, the committee counted costs alongside photons. Large apertures are a rare currency. Every extra script displaces another program. Still, the dataset had already earned its keep by killing attractive ghosts, algorithmic mirages, easy jets, loud beacons, wasteful heat. What remained demanded quieter imagination and better light. A final stress sequence tested the period's loyalty. Exposure times were jittered intentionally to see if the peak would dance with the schedule. It did not dance, but it faded as phase angles drifted away from the tight corridor. Geometry, not cadence, seemed to hold the stronger lever. If a modulation exists, it prefers a narrow stage the sky seldom grants. Rank update. Natural explanation rose a notch. Engineered modulation stayed plausible but cramped. The stack closed like a ledger. On one branch, a rough or microstructured surface with a narrow forward lobe, sampled at perihelion geometry, yields a sharp achromatic bend. Residuals are likely to shrink under better polarimetry and symmetric phase tests. On the parallel branch, a faint, short period hint perches just above threshold, too stubborn to dismiss, too gentle to claim demanding replication under different cadence, hardware, and geometry. Between them, silence in radio and ceilings in infrared fence out the loud and the wasteful. Quiet engineering and austere nature remain. The investigation moves forward with both branches intact because both have survived the only honest trial available at the start, an organized attempt to make them disappear. Silence entered the log with numbers, not adjectives. The narrowband sweep across favored beacon lanes reported no carrier above its declared floor. A floor built from integration time, system temperature, and beam shape rather than optimism. A burst search trolled short timescales and returned the same verdict. The entry did not celebrate absence. It turned it into a bound. Anything engineered that speaks loudly, regularly, or wastefully would have crossed that line. It did not. The first pruning therefore cut the theatrical branches and left only the frugal or the natural standing. Infrared checks wrote a second boundary in equally plain terms. If waste heat leaked, even modestly, near IR flux should have risen from a quiet continuum. It did not, within errors that were itemized beside exposure ladders and seeing metrics. That does not mean cold, it means colder than this ceiling. The team pinned that ceiling beside the optical curve, so future models cannot wander warmer than the data allow. High power engineering thrusters, bright radiators shouting lost footing, low signature scenarios and surface physics kept theirs without promotion. Null spectra did the same quiet work. Low resolution passes, telluric corrected against nearby standards, found no decisive emission where volatile activity usually whispers. The absence did not prove a dry body, but it denied jets the right to explain the kink without paying a spectral cost. Upper limits were archived, like coordinates, equivalent width caps with uncertainties traced to calibration lamps and skylines. By writing the ceiling, the pipeline removed the shortcut story and pushed geometry and surface reflectance back to the front of the queue. Internal quiet mattered as much as sky quiet. Control stars flown through identical cadences refused to grow the short period alleged in the target. Comparison fields would not counterfeit the timing hint. That local silence fenced out algorithmic charm and rolling shutter folklore. With each non-detection quantified, the hypothesis tree thinned. Loud beacons gone, flamboyant heat capped, easy jets taxed, garden variety artifacts priced out. What remained were two lean paths, an austere natural geometry sharpened by perihelion and a power-thrifty modulation hiding beneath limits each now confined by silence that has been measured, versioned, and made useful. In this grammar, zero is not a shrug. It is an active verb that rules out, narrows, and sets the cost of being wrong. The provisional resolution is intentionally lean. The perihelion bend is, for now, best accounted for by an austere, natural scenario. A surface with narrow forward scattering lobes, possibly microstructured or clustered, sampled at a geometry that magnifies small features into sudden turns. It explains the largely achromatic kink, respects the quiet spectrum, and requires fewer moving parts than engines, beacons, or thermal contraptions. Occam keeps the pen until stronger evidence asks for it back. Two curiosities remain on the ledger. First, a shallow, repeatable hint of short-period structure that survived the easiest aliasing traps but never rose above hard independence from cadence and hardware. Second, a tiny observed minus computed lean across the window, brushing astrometric thresholds while granting thermal recoil the first right of explanation. Both are real enough to track and fragile enough to break. They stay as disciplined doubts with named tests, not as headlines. Promotion gates are written in advance. A modulation claim must persist through instrument swaps, deliberate cadence jitter, and a broadened phase angle. A period that follows the camera or the schedule earns a stamped exit. An astrometric kick must stand when plate solutions change, catalogs rotate, and recoil models absorb heat they are entitled to. Passing these gates lifts belief by design. Failing returns the feature to the quiet shelf where unreplicated ideas wait their turn. Statistics travel with receipts. Effect sizes carry confidence intervals. Periodograms ship with injection recovery curves that show both miscatches and false bites. Astrometry is reported with full covariance, catalog lineage, and fit residuals that readers can audit. Where choices hinge, the team prefers pre-registered thresholds or conservative Bayes factors over appetite. The policy is simple. Make overclaiming expensive and the publication of a null respectable. Replication is the currency that spends everywhere. Raw frames, headers intact, and processing notebooks are being packaged under a shared DOI family. Outside groups are invited to reduce the data with alien pipelines and to publish both confirmations and nulls. Independence is framed as a feature, not a threat. If the phenomenon is real, it will survive uninterested hands. If it is not, those hands will erase it more cleanly than loyalty ever could. The next Windows worklist is aimed at the narrowest cuts. Symmetric phase angles will test whether geometry alone sculpts the bend. A mirror should answer to symmetry. Polarimetry will try to pin the phase function and compress residuals that photometry left ambiguous. If geometry and prediction allow, a stellar occultation could expose unresolved substructure without modeling it into existence. Near-infrared repeats will push the thermal ceiling down by another small, honest notch. Radio teams will rerun narrowband and burst searches at the same floors, so silence can speak twice with comparable weight. Resource costs are kept in view, not in footnotes. Across the window, roughly 240 minutes of high-demand aperture time and more than 3,000 plus small aperture frames were diverted into this thread. Analysts spent nights auditing flats, clocks, and sky backgrounds. Schedulers paid in opportunity costs as other programs idled. The dataset must repay that debt in clarity, if not by a claim, then by limits that future proposals can bank. Reputation is a parallel budget. The writing stays accountant plain. Thresholds first, adjectives never. Public appetite for impossible is acknowledged and declined. Here the word means unmodeled, not otherworldly. The standing statement is designed to cool, not to inflame. Unusual, reproducible photometry near perihelion. A faint periodic suggestion, not yet instrument agnostic. No radio carrier above limits. No thermal excess above ceiling. No spectral line that would rent an easy jet. Anyone can check the math. Governance keeps the rails straight. Methods are versioned. Code commits are tagged. Provenance is preserved in headers. Intermediate products are archived with checksums. A blinded subset will be re-reduced by a partner lab committed to publishing regardless of outcome. These are not ornaments. They are the structure that prevents a lively anomaly from drifting into a flexible story when the next graph arrives. Falsifiability stays within reach. A decisive polarization swing aligned with forward scattering models would compress the hypothesis tree toward the natural branch and close engineered scenarios without fanfare. A period that ignores cadence tricks, repeats across instruments, and persists away from perihelion geometry would push in the other direction. A firm astrometric residual that rejects thermal recoil would move the needle again. Each outcome is pre-written. None requires new rhetoric. The summary remains spare. We have spent minutes and attention to turn rumor into event into a map, and map into tests. The sky can actually run. Kept today. A simple natural account that fits most data with the fewest assumptions, plus 2 narrow doubts that owe us replication. Refuse today, hurry. The object has left perihelion, the evidence remains, the debt to clarity sits on the books, payable in the next window's light. The next window is set by geometry, not appetite. As the target climbs from the sun, phase angles widen into the mirror of the perihelion corridor. That symmetry is the key assay. If viewing sculpted the kink, a counter shape should rise at comparable but opposite angles. Schedulers favor cadence over depth, interleaving polarimetry on clear nights. A small occultation prospect lingers. If predictions tighten, fields will be narrowed and clocks rehearsed to catch it without heroics. Preparation is intentionally dull and portable. Scripts are scrubbed of clever tweaks and written to survive hardware disagreements while worshiping the same clocks. Polarimetric 0 points will be tied nightly to bright standards. Near-infrared frames will push the thermal ceiling lower even if the answer is still quiet. Radio teams will rerun narrowband and burst searches at the same floors so that silence, if it returns, can speak comparably. Every repeat is a control in disguise. Belief thresholds are fixed before the light arrives. A polarization swing that locks to phase constraints, a replicated period that ignores cadence, jitter, and hardware swaps, or an astrometric residual that refuses thermal recoil, any single result would collapse the branching. Absent those, the lean natural account remains the cheapest fit. Publication is not conditional on thrill. Nulls are scripted into the report, not appended as apology. Replication by groups outside the network remains the currency of trust. 2 reflections close the ledger. First, perihelion is a lens for signals and appetites alike. Geometry can make ordinary surfaces look uncanny, and pipelines can make uncanny things look tame. The discipline is to let neither impulse write the story. Second, measured quiet is not empty. Radio floors, infrared ceilings, telluric clean spectra, and control stars carved real fences through speculation. Models now must walk between them rather than around them. The map forward is narrow by design. Symmetric phase photometry will test the viewing hypothesis. Polarimetry will try to pin the phase function and shrink residuals. An occultation, if geometry allows, could expose substructure without guesswork. If the short period is real, it will persist away from the tight corridor and survive instruments that disagree about everything except time. If it is not, cadence and weather will erase it cleanly. The film closes on the network's standing rule. If it is real, it will survive better light. The perihelion window gave the anomaly its first trial. The outbound window offers its second. Between them sits ordinary work maintenance, pre-registered analyses, and journals patient enough for careful prose. Whatever the next frames decide, mirror, echo, or return to baseline, the debt to clarity will be paid in the only durable tender this field accepts, methods others can trust.